Hi, my name is Stefan Korshak. I'm the senior defense correspondent of Kyiv Post newspaper, and we are very lucky today to have with us Australian Major General Mick Ryan. He is 35 years retired now, experience in the Australian military. He's a writer. He recently published a book called War Transformed, which looks at the way armies are having to change the way they go about business. He's here in Ukraine visiting us, and he's agreed to give us some of his time. So thank you very much for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
And General, or Mick, I'd probably like to step away a little bit from the standard questions. What do you think is going on in Bakhmut? What about those missiles that hit Kyiv the other day? And I'd like to sort of get a little bit into how you see the Ukrainian army developing. Your book, as I understand it, I only read pieces of it, unfortunately, focuses on the human side of warfighting, how equipment is great, but at the end of the day, the man or woman using that equipment is critical to success. We've got, a very advanced technologies now being used in this war in ways that lots of people never expected. What do you think? How is the Ukrainian army right now going about its business from the personnel side, the human side? What are they getting right, do you think? What are they getting wrong? And what challenges do you think they're going to face going ahead?
Well, it's hard to know everything that's going on. I mean, in wartime, for lots of reasons, you don't see everything that's going on. And in a large organisation, even the senior people don't always see everything. They see important things. I think when we talk about Ukrainian armed forces and how they're going, we really need to go back to before the war when they started transforming after 2014 and 2015, because that provided a foundation for the Ukrainian armed forces that exist today. They changed their size, they changed the amount of resources that went into the Ukrainian armed forces. They started realigning themselves with NATO training. They brought in NATO trainers, they sent people to NATO training schools. And I think that transformation pre-2022 really provided an excellent foundation for the expansion and the ongoing development of the Ukrainian armed forces as we see today. And so what do we see today? It's the Ukrainian armed forces, but there are lots of elements to the Ukrainian army. The Territorial Defence Force, you've got the professional army, which is made of the old soldiers and the newly mobilised soldiers. There appears to be lots of little independent units. You have foreign troops as well. And bringing that all together is a pretty big challenge in an army that's expanded quickly, that now has lots and lots of brigades that it didn't have, say, 18 months ago. That's a pretty big challenge, and even the very best generals would be challenged by that kind of undertaking, and to do it during wartime only makes it harder.
In wartime, it's one of these lessons that I guess humanity keeps learning over and over and over, is that before the war, it really looks, you look at the equipment, you look at what's driving around on the parade, and you make your judgments about a military's capacity based on that. And then when the shooting starts, everybody starts talking about, small unit leaders. Just before we went on camera, I was talking about the sergeant who is standing next to the soldier who's saying, no, stay in that hole, cover that sector. And it's one of these old lessons that continually is being relearned. And now Ukraine is in a very big war. They have an army that is motivated, but it is not fully trained. And in order to succeed on the battlefield, again, the old lesson relearned, they need somehow to develop not just effective small unit leaders, but a core of small unit leaders that renews itself, and they're taking casualties in the process. How do you think that will go? Do you think that the Ukrainians can get to a point where they can execute, for instance, a high-pace attack, like, for instance, the Americans in Iraq the coalition, I should say, in Iraq in 1991? Or is that really beyond them, given the circumstances that they're taking casualties and they simply don't have a fully trained force to start out with? What do you think?
No, I don't think it's beyond the Ukrainian Armed Forces at all. I mean, the key with leadership is it doesn't just happen. You've got to make it happen. You've got to have the systems, the training, the talent identification, the promotion systems, and giving them the experience. And whether it's a squad leader, platoon leader, company commander, battalion, brigade, army, corps commander, all of them need to be developed. Experience alone is not enough when it comes to good leadership. You need to have different experiences and different training to make you a better leader. And I see that happening. It's just such a big organisation that it's often hard for peacetime training institutions to keep up with the demands of an expanded wartime institution. Unfortunately, I think this war is probably going to go long enough that the training institution will catch up. But I think too, this is why NATO training is so important. It supplements and fills the gap between the Ukrainian Armed Forces training institutions and the requirement of the combat forces. So whether it's basic training that's undertaken by many countries, I know there's even Australian troops doing this in the United Kingdom with the Netherlands and the Brits and others, but also staff training at battalion and brigade levels, training of squad leaders, platoon leaders. All of these things are really important, not just for the Ukrainian Armed Forces, but for NATO to have a systemic and widespread approach to undertaking.
And jumping onto that and sort of taking that a step forward, if you're talking about NATO training and NATO standards, that's an ideal. And even if the Ukrainians over time could reach that standard, there is the question, and which I am about to ask, about whether or not pure NATO standards are exactly what Ukraine should be shooting for, particularly from the point of view of the force that they have and the kind of people that they have in their force and the kind of goals that they're setting themselves. For instance, the standard example that is that in a high-pace combined arms attack by a NATO force, even a specialist, an individual soldier, can see an opportunity and kick information up the chain of command, which will very quickly bring a great deal of force, firepower, down on whatever needs to be engaged. That could be a goal towards which the Ukrainians should move. It might even be something that some Ukrainian units could achieve. But the NATO standard is every combat formation, at least theoretically, is capable of that degree of flexibility and that degree of integration of, what do we call them, firing systems, support systems. Is that something that the Ukrainians should be shooting for? If not, or if not to that degree, where do you think they should be focusing their human effort to be effective on the battlefield?
Well, I think it's important to note that NATO standards and the standardisation agreements, STANAGs, are not about making every soldier an Achilles in the modern day or every leader a modern day pattern. That's not what NATO standards are about. What they provide for is the minimum level of warfighting capacity, logistic capacity, intelligence and those kind of things so you can work with other partners. So these aren't about really high absolute standards. These are about the minimum standards to function as a military organisation within a larger alliance. I think NATO and Ukraine have been working towards that since the late 1990s with the Comprehensive Partnership, which has provided the baseline for a lot of the current support that's been provided to Ukraine. I think it's a realistic aspiration for Ukraine. Many armies, even the Australian Army, used to work to NATO standards because every institution needs a common standard to work to, so you can judge, are we effective? Are we good at what the government is asking us to do? So I think it's realistic. I think the NATO standard is probably the right one for Ukraine. It wants to be part of NATO in the future. But it's a long journey to get there for every nation, not just Ukraine. Even NATO countries have issues getting to NATO standards at times. But I think it's realistic and it's a good aspiration to have.
Okay, and probably the last question then would be, how do you see the Ukrainian force developing over time with regards to their opponent, the Russian military, which is not, I think everybody will agree, the same Russian military that invaded Ukraine a year ago? You know this better than me. It is now, in relative terms, much less well trained It carries with it less equipment, by many standards, less firepower. It is less flexible, even though at the outset it wasn't that flexible. It may be having morale problems, but then again, maybe it doesn't. It isn't having those problems. In your view, what kind of force should the Ukrainians be building, especially from the individual soldier and small unit and battalion and brigade level command, to take advantage of that force to fight that force most effectively? What should the Ukrainians be doing, do you think, to, well, if you will, defeat those kinds of Russian formations in combat?
Well, I think they've demonstrated over the last 13 months they pretty well know what to do, which is beat the Russians and kick them out of Ukraine, out of all Ukraine. That's the simplistic answer. I think the more detailed one is, in every war, armies fight two battles. One is the war against the enemy, where you want to kill the enemy, kick them off your land, defeat them. That's what the Ukrainian armed forces are doing against the Russians. But the other war is the war within. Every army changes as wars go on, as it learns. There's a fight between the old people and the new people in the army. There's a fight between different elements of the army that some become more important and some become less important, transition from horses to tanks, for example. There's a fight between regulars and reserves. And these kind of fights for the soul of an army, you can probably intuit that it's also going on in the Ukrainian armed forces at the moment. There's the battle between the old Soviet ideas and newer ideas that young people are bringing into the military. That is entirely natural. It's what's happened in every army going back to Alexander the Great. It's not necessarily a new insight, but we have to understand that because commanders have to balance killing the enemy with allowing their army to learn and evolve as it moves forward in the war. I mean, if you have a look through history, whether it's World War I or World War II, the US Army that went into World War II is not the US Army that came out of it. Very different organisation. The British Army that went into World War I is not the one that came out of it. And the Ukrainian Army that comes out of this war, after victory over Russia, will be a very different one that came in. So what are the kind of things it needs to have? First and foremost, it needs good leadership. And I think there's a leadership asymmetry where the leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces has been better than the Russian armed forces. That doesn't mean either of them are perfect or awful, just means the Ukrainians have been better. I think it needs to balance, heavy forces with light forces depending on where they are, but also you can only buy so many tanks, you can only have so many self-propelled howitzers. I mean, the economics of war kicks in at some point. And I think too, we're learning lessons about crewed attack helicopters, about how vulnerable they are, about the importance of air defence, drone defences, missile defences, and how much do you invest in that versus frontline combat troops. All these kind of lessons are being learned and absorbed by the Ukrainian armed forces. And my view is that the Ukrainians are probably the best army in the world at the moment. It's not probably, they are. They are the best army in the world. They're the most experienced at modern warfare. They've demonstrated that over the last 13 months. Now they've shed a lot of blood and lost a lot of young men and women, and older men and women, to be honest, to learn the many lessons that they've learnt. But they are the best army in the world. There is much that we can all learn from them. And that's part of the reason why I'm here, is to humbly learn the many lessons that the Ukrainian armed forces have learned at great cost.
Well, General Ryan, thank you. Let's hope that that does indeed happen. This is Stefan Korshak, Kyiv Post. I've been with Mick Ryan. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Stefan.